All right, great. So welcome everyone to the AI Expert Network Innovation Lab series. This is intended to be an interactive way for us to collaborate, innovate, and make a difference together. Timothy isn't able to join us today, but he did want me to make a few key announcements. The first is we will be having 7 more Innovation Lab sessions in 2023. If you are interested in hosting a session or interested in hearing from someone, please reach out to him directly. We'd also like to invite you to the AI working teams. So these teams have done great work that's been cited by the FDA, WHO, and they've been a foundation for many standards. And it has also earned global credibility. So contact Timothy if you'd like to join. And we'd like to thank you for the continued participation and engagement in our community. Just a recap of our mission. So many of you are familiar with AFTO-RAP's the Healthcare Products Collaborative mission, which sounds very much like the mission you were familiar with Xavier Health. We are continuing that mission here, which is to establish a collaborative forum of AI experts across academia, government, and industry, and accelerating the development of AI solutions for the benefit of the global healthcare community. And the lab sessions focus is on being a community where we can have open discussion, free-flowing idea exchange, and really a place where like-minded individuals can speak together regarding AI topics. One last thing I usually mention were the AI reads. And so we do have Sean on the call today, but the FDA released their draft guidance on predetermined change control plans for AI and ML enabled medical devices just yesterday, so hot off the presses. I recommend that each of you take a look at that if you haven't had the chance yet. And now I'm excited to introduce today's topic and speaker, best practices when building AI-based medical devices at scale, which will be led by Erez Kaminsky. So Erez is the CEO and founder of Ketrix Corporation, a company striving to create innovative new approaches to regulated software development. Over the last decade, he worked in various industries, including computational mathematics, biotech, and energy, developing mission-critical applications like monitoring systems for pharmaceutical equipment and AI for medication management. Erez is deeply concerned with improving patient care and health outcomes with software solutions. Through Ketrix, he is redefining the complex process of regulated software development and empowering others to change lives and improve software safety and quality. Prior to Ketrix, Erez worked with Amgen, the world's largest biotechnology company, as the head of AI/ML for their medical device division, and with Wolfram Research, the builders of Mathematica and Wolfram Alpha. Throughout his career, Erez has helped companies large and small build and improve the safety and reliability of their software, and he now dedicates his time and focus to improving patient safety and expanding the possibilities for regulated software, especially as they pertain to AI, ML, and open source software. Erez holds a Master of Science in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science and a Master's of Business Administration from MIT, and served as a platoon sergeant in the Israeli Defense Forces. And finally, I'd like to commend Erez for tackling this problem, as many traditional companies can take 6 months to sometimes even years in deploying AI-based medical device software updates, but his platform provides an effective alternative to deploy within weeks to even days. So at this point, I'll turn things over to Erez. So tell us why you were interested in talking about this topic today.
So before I start, why am I interested? So first of all, thank you, Simon and Timothy and the FADO team for inviting us to come here. And Simon, thank you for such kind words. It means a lot coming from you. Why am I interested? So why am I interested in this? So it really comes down to 2 reasons for me. One is when I moved to work in the regulated pharmaceutical industry, I just saw a challenge that seemed complicated and interesting and important to solve. So I wanted to go solve it. And the other part is my mother is both a patient and a physician of ENT. She's a interventional ear surgeon that focuses on cochlear implants, and she was the first person in the world to have had a cochlear implant while performing cochlear implant surgery. So I grew up with a mother who's profoundly deaf, and this kind of sparked a lifelong interest in medical software and the challenges that medical devices have. bringing in life-saving innovation to market. So that's kind of why I'm doing what I'm doing with my life. And then can I just screen share, Simon?
Yes, of course.
So let's get this started. So can everybody see my screen? Wonderful. Yes. You guys can see my screen here, right?
Yes, we can see it.
Wonderful. So one is, please feel free to ask questions throughout. I think this is supposed to be a forum, a discussion. So I'm really happy to talk to folks and just hear what everybody has to say. And if I look sometimes to the left, it's because I'm trying to see who I'm talking to, because I have another screen here. So my talk, like Simon said, is about best practices when building AI-based medical devices at scale. It's kind of a continuation of a talk I gave almost 2 years ago here, which was more about NLP, and this project through time kind of developed into how people build not just language processing models, but AI systems and software systems as an extension of that. And I think there's a lot of companies and a lot of folks talking about how to even do it as a one-off. And what I'm really interested in is how to do it not just as a one-off, but a large scale, when you're serving, you know, millions of patients all over the world with regional regulators, with rapid deployment of multiple products that share infrastructure and services as they do in the rest of the kind of software industry. And I think that presents a lot of limitations. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about, and how I think teams best manage that. And also a little bit about how we internally at Ketrix manage that, because we have our own kind of large scale cloud-based deployment, which is scaling more and more every day with wonderful partners. A little bit about my background. Simon already went through it. I won't go through it again, but basically I'm a nerd, love math. I went to work for a company that does mathematics professionally and helped work on products that serve about 1 billion people every day. If you have an iPhone, you have something that Wolfram Research made or is deploying, serving you. And then I was fortunate enough to work at Amgen, where I was helping an organization serve patients through better medical devices. Really kind of brought me home to what I grew up with, growing up in the house of a patient physician. And I kind of realized that that's what I wanted to do with my life, is help people make software that can affect patients' life and make not just software systems, but systems overall safe and reliable. I'm going to start with a few statements before we get into kind of the meat of the topic that I think explain well why is it so hard to do what folks in this room are trying to do. And I think the first thing is that building any type of highly regulated software and any type of validated system is very hard. I'm sure Simon can share quite a bit of thoughts about this. He's been doing it for a long time, and other folks in the room. It's just very difficult. It's even difficult to create a small embedded piece of software that is validated to a high level of assurance. Period. End of the slide, right? It's just really, really hard. The other part that's hard is that it is hard, and let me just align this. It's hard to deploy anything at scale. Right? Like there's a reason that large corporations of the Google and Apple and Microsoft spend a lot of money hiring great DevOps engineers, great cloud engineers, great AI and ML engineers and software engineers, because it is very, very difficult to deploy any type of software globally at scale with the certain performance requirement that even non-safety critical software requires. Bringing those two together makes a task that seems to be impossible. Right? Like it's hard enough to build any piece of regulated software. It's hard enough to deploy any software at scale, but now trying to deploy at scale highly validated systems. When I first understood where the industry was going and seeing how it was conducting itself at the time and still today, I started thinking, wow, deploying systems in a microservice architecture or any kind of complex system of systems of software serving a global market, still with the level of reliability patients would expect, I'm not even sure how people are going to do that. And I think there's now the beginnings of many experiments in doing that at scale. I think there's many, many years until we get to the scale that like a Google has for medical software, for rapidly developed medical software especially. And I started thinking for a long time about how I would solve this and what tools need to be in place in order to enable that. Before I get into the rest of the presentations, any questions, disagreements, arguments, anything we want to talk about right here? Wonderful.
I think the other thing I would add, Erez, is also speed. Many times it's beneficial to deploy software updates quickly, whether it's to address security patches or issues. And you want to be able to do that at scale. So speed is a third thing I would add.
Yeah, and to me, Simon, totally fair. And in some ways, to me, like scale and speed are very interrelated. Like you can't actually deploy at huge scale if you can't deploy very fast because of the issues you mentioned, right? Like maybe if you had one embedded vulnerability on a device that has a risk mitigation on it to prevent that, any kind of vulnerability from being actualized, that's one thing. But if you're deploying at kind of these massive cloud scales, I think there's no other option than updating things really fast. But I totally agree with that. And I think they're very related, right? Like when people think about scale, they mean scale, speed, and agility.
So there is one question about the scale piece here. So when you're talking about developing and deploying regulated software, it's not just like scaling for one particular device for many users. It's also multiple products that are being deployed in parallel, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of the next few slides, but it's basically what if you have, let's say we have one product, right, that's deployed across 4 different regulatory regions. There's privacy regulation on top of that. And then maybe you want to deploy versions of that product. Maybe you're holding multiple versions live of that product, and then you want to fork that product and do something very similar for another device you have or another treatment you have. And then that becomes very, very complicated. When we have dozens of deployed products, every one of them has regional specific versions, maybe deployed on certain clouds because of privacy regulations, for example, in Germany. That's the type of complexity. Like, how do you even maintain a system like that to be compliant? I think is not an answered question. Does that make sense, Seema?
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. So let's talk a little bit about the current state of AI and ML system validation. Then the next slide is kind of about this complexity issue and what we mean by scale. We see a lot of issues. I work across a pretty large amount of companies. I'm fortunate because I run an organization that serves a lot of different clients that have pretty large scale. And the main problems we see are about design controls, the design controls as a methodology, and especially the historical legacy we have of design control SOPs that come from hardware manufacturing are very difficult to manage in a CI/CD environment. I think design controls are a critical concept, both for medical devices and actually, I think for non-medical systems, people would save a lot of money if they did proper design control kind of processes and activities. But the way they're designed in many companies is not really built for a continuous integration, continuous deployment environment. And it becomes very burdensome to make sure everything is aligned. And I've heard stories of quite large teams that spend a lot of manual time making sure everything is checked correctly and filed correctly. And there's always this fear that maybe we're doing all this work and it's still not enough. The second factor relates to that, right? The teams, as a result of this challenge, perform an immense amount of manual work. We usually see 3 types of manual work that people do. People copy and paste between different systems. People copy and paste from systems to compliance documents. And then people manually ensure that processes are followed. Sometimes people kind of don't think about that last part, but I think it's quite a huge risk from a compliance and safety perspective, but also it's just a huge challenge to do that. And the last part is that current kind of change management tools and workflows, instead of being advantageous to change, being kind of something you want to use to perform change, are an obstacle to change in many organizations, and people would rather not perform change management in these tools because of them. just kind of going forward with this, and this Seema is much more related to what you're talking about. What is this complexity and challenges I'm trying to talk about? So one is this regulation and standard compliance, and maybe you need to comply with many different regulations across many different jurisdictions and many different standards across many different jurisdictions. And I think for many people, you know, if you're talking about folks entering this field, whether as innovators or as engineers, different kind of folks who are wanting to take part in a regulated medical environment because they want to be part of a mission to help patients and to improve healthcare outcomes, they come into the industry and they tend to be shocked by the way things are done and the level of rigor that is expected here. And it takes some time to even understand that. The second part is the regional nature of it makes it very, very hard to do. And the last is what I call kind of complexity to the end. Because if you think that developing cloud-based software is complicated or any kind of software is complicated, developing a validated cloud-based system or AI-based system is extremely complicated because you're actually maintaining a few different products. One of them is the code, but there's many other kind of factors to it that don't exist in regular software development compared to regulated software development. And one of the things I like to show in this graph on the right-hand side here, this kind of pyramid graph, is just the levels of complexity. And we sometimes call this the turtle problem, because you are building a validated application which sits on kind of many different layers of things, many different layers of turtles, that each of them then recursively needs to be configured, validated, and assured, right? That's also a challenge because the more modern type of software, data-driven software your application is dependent on, the more robust your non-product software or infrastructure is going to be. And so validating that becomes a bigger and bigger challenge. And I think a lot of teams in the world have realized that in order to produce AI and ML applications, they need to create an entirely other product, which is the validated infrastructure in which they do this. And we see teams that spend an immense amount of effort, time, and money in creating validated document generating infrastructure that they now need to maintain forever. And that's part of this complexity to the end problem, right? It's just the more stuff you have, the more you need to maintain. The faster it goes, the more complicated it gets. And suddenly you find yourself maintaining, sure, you have a few different applications, but you also have a few different non-product software infrastructure setups, different configurations, a massive software supply chain you pull from, and so on. And this is really the setup for the whole talk. So if there's any questions, would love to have some discussions here. And if not, I'll just move to the next slide. So the next one is a little bit about what to do. So how do you solve this? We can even jump, if people are interested now or later on, to see a little bit about how we solve it in our product. But basically the way I think about it is, one, you want to connect all the different systems you're using. You want to have traceability as a core artifact of everything that you do. I think many teams produce traceability kind of post hoc instead of prior to the work. And traceability has huge, powerful features that allow you to work actually much faster if you focus on it. And then the last thing is automating as much as possible from an evidence generation standpoint, right? You want the evidence to be generated from the tools you're using and not the other way around. And there's many different ways that we've solved that in Ketrix, out of the way we kind of merge different systems together to produce evidence documents, to document the work itself, different controls we've implemented that prevent people from doing actions they shouldn't be doing, and different ways to automate evidence generation kind of across the gambit of typical documents you need to create. And so that's one part of the problem, right? The ability to make sure you have proper systems that connect everything and trace everything and generate the evidence. Another part of the problem is the logical framework of your QMS, of your quality system, really built for this level of change, scale, and data-driven challenges, right? There's a lot of challenges around making AI systems because, again, you don't just have one product now, you also have the data, which is another product, just kind of more and more turtles creeping up with time. So the way I think about it, and I think is the way folks at the FDA and other organizations that help design standards like 62304, think about it, is through a concept called configuration items. So if the previous slide was about certain structural and tooling things you need to do, this slide is really about the conceptual framework that helps do this faster. This idea, which is kind of an underpinning of configuration management that some folks, I think, over time, it's kind of lost its appeal, but it's still so powerful. This idea is to decouple as much as possible the different ideas that represent your validated system, whether that's the requirements or specifications or the codes or the tests or whatnot, in order to be able to better understand where risk comes from pre-market, but also in a better way to analyze where risk comes from in the post-market. So in this case, and the way we manage it in Ketrix, both for our internal product and both for kind of customers who use our product, is every one of these kind of points in space, a single use case, a single requirement or more, represents a configuration item that the system tracks in real time across any other connected system you're using, whether that's Jira or GitHub or AWS. It allows all of them to maintain traceability and to only trace to different items that make sense. That's a big part of what we're trying to do. The next part is to introduce post-market surveillance directly into this process, right? And as we think about building massive systems at scale, post-market surveillance is a critical component of that, whether that's passive surveillance as it's done now or active surveillance that is going to develop over the next few years. And some companies are already doing some forms of active surveillance. Most interestingly enough, right, in the tech industry, people do active surveillance all the time. It's considered to be kind of the most basic of things you want to do from the first week of a startup. It's fascinating that it's not necessarily considered a huge source of pride in the medical device industry because of some regulations that make it a little more complicated to do and a lot of documentation involved in that. But this is the core of the kind of regulated process in my mind, to ensure that what you have on the market is indeed what you promised patients you would provide them. And the more, again, you decouple these ideas, the easier it would become to identify risk in ways that you did not understand earlier. So if I do decouple everything to this extent, and when I say decouple, we don't even manage anything in documents. Documents are a result of our work. It's not something we work in. And that gives us the ability to trace and connect things. And then as complaints or product feedback comes in with time and we identify the underlying anomaly and problems, we can discover the different risks associated with them and then where that risk emerges from. In this case, it's pointing to some specification that was incorrectly kind of described and verified. And eventually that would lead to a change. That's the other part of managing things in a traceable and kind of local manner, is the ability to understand how the change in those things affects other things, right? So one example in Ketrix that I'll just show is if I want to see the difference between, for example, one product version 2 to a previous product version, I can come and say, show me all the different things, show me all the requirements that are risk controls that are new or changed in this version, for example. Right, so it's a way to focus on change with knowing what each element has in it. Now, if this makes sense, so one is we talked about you want to have a lot of tools around this. The second is you want to adjust your quality management system to be able to adapt to a larger set of configuration items and to also manage them with the tools you have, right? Because tools and processes and people are kind of the three things you mix together to make a QMS. And once you could do that, there's huge amounts of power in the ability to share requirements, specifications, and code, and the ability to analyze them. And in many ways, this is what the regulation was built under. I just think with time, there wasn't the right tools to do this, and there wasn't necessarily a huge need, and there was a divergence between how people maybe thought about this originally in the 80s and 70s and the way it's implemented at scale now. Any questions about this framework, which I'm sure is not new to many people, but is a core to my argument of how to build and deploy safety critical software at scale?
Well, I'd just like to say that I think it's powerful that when you talk about version tracing and tracking, that you have an associated suite of categories that are well defined. I'm a non-coder, so when I think about version history or version tracing, I think about the code, but this it seems to be much more powerful.
Yeah, and this is kind of taking that idea of branching in Git and saying, what if you could do that for everything, all your design controls and everything else, and every particular under kind of item in your design controls, right? Because that's what it means to work in scale. You have hundreds, thousands of people working on it. They're sharing resources. Ideally, they're sharing as much as possible. You don't want to implement the same kind of procedure twice. And if you manage it like this, it allows you to do that. So I appreciate that comment. Anything else about this room?
So Aris, what did you mean by the active surveillance? Because I mean, if we are talking in terms of an AI machine learning model, you don't wait to react. So there is that whole monitoring feedback loop. So where is that in this picture?
Yeah, so active surveillance. One is I think this is kind of part of the feedback loop. It just depends, you know, in the case of a machine learning model, maybe it happens kind of faster or earlier. But when I say active surveillance, I mean the concept of instead of passively waiting for feedback and complaints to come from the market, you as a company are actively searching, for example, through electronic medical records to see if certain population groups are affected by a product in a certain way. And then you kind of discover risk actively instead of passively waiting to hear from them. Does that make sense, Seema?
Okay, understood.
So it's, and I agree with you, it's all related eventually to the machine learning training cycle in this case, right? It's just this change is what you're kind of referring to, right? That there's maybe a very rapid change here. You identify, for example, perhaps you've identified through either passive or active surveillance that for a certain demographic, your image processing or genetic test is not working as intended. And then you need to perform change to include more data in your training data to accommodate that demographic, right? That's very related to this.
Right. Yeah. So it's not necessarily a complaint that came in. You were just monitoring your device or your model, and you are beginning to see some anomalies even before a complaint comes in. But it's the same concept. Yeah.
Yeah. So sometimes, right, if it's internal, you could call that. Some people might call that product feedback because they don't want a complaint, or I think you could discover anomalies and deviations, right? Definitely kind of during pre-market or while you just monitor the product. And then I want to take this and start talking about kind of the larger setting. I don't know why this T is like that, so I apologize, but this is the way we think of the regulated development journey and all the different steps involved in that. So my plan is to kind of go one by one in these steps. And this is a diagram that allows you to see the activities that are part of conformance with things like 13485, 14971, 62304, and then just other things that are just practical to the work itself. And I kind of want to go through it and just talk to folks about what I see as the challenges in different steps and different solutions for that, and then just have a discussion over them. So this is kind of the meat of the whole presentation. And it all, of course, starts with planning, right? You need to understand what you're trying to do and how you're going to do it as a group. I think one thing is to plan for the long term. I always come back to this issue of trying to do a little thing and then figuring it out later, that little thing, because we only tried to do it as fast as possible or without really planning of what happens if it succeeds. We don't really have the proper tools in place to deploy it at scale, and that could take many years to mitigate later on. The second factor is to configure the systems you're using for the purpose at hand. So many existing purpose-built systems for hardware validation, mostly, sometimes they're used for software validation, are not really configured for this purpose of the scalability of AI and web-based development. And folks end up using many different existing software development tools and configuring them one by one and validating them one by one for their own use. And at the end of the day, it's sometimes very hard to configure them all together as a single suite. So I think that's something to think of from the start. What tools are we going to use? How are we going to configure them together? And how are we going to tie them into our processes? The third part is understanding the burden of non-product software validation. As someone who develops, pretty large non-product software systems, I'd say that the initial conception is you think, well, the non-product software, it's not a product, it's a small thing. It's not going to be as complicated as the medical device. Well, the issue is the medical device sometimes does a very specific intended use with a very specific set of requirements and specifications. And while the non-product software piece that you're using as the automated manufacturing system or the automated quality system could be much more complicated because the use case is very, very general, right? That's one of the hardships of this is the use case of developing regulated software is a pretty difficult use case to pin down and ensure that you're doing everything around it. And then, if you think that the burden is not going to be large, maybe you're trying to do it in-house and you discover that over the years, perhaps you now have an additional team that is, a certain portion of your entire R&D team that is just dedicated to supporting, maintaining, and validating non-product software systems. I just want to stop here for a second. I think it's such an interesting topic, the planning aspect of this, and the idea that the infrastructure is a big part. And I don't know if folks want to share kind of how they've seen this before, act out in their companies or the companies they worked in.
I have a question about your use of the term use case in this particular slide. I'm not sure what you're referring to, and I'm thinking maybe what you mean is that once you define an application, the specificity of the requirements can be ambiguous or difficult. That is to say, what hardware it's operating on, or what, if, for example, in manufacturing, what specific brand of instrumentation is generating the data. Are you saying that the use case varies or is difficult because each application, in a sense, is unique?
It's because the use case for a medical device can be quite narrow and by intent, right? That's the kind of the point. But the use case for a large-scale, scalable, automated software manufacturing system could be extremely complex because you're trying to support, let's say, 20 or 30 products that are quite different, ideally from the same set of non-product software infrastructure. And that's what I mean by that. Like, the use case is developing, deploying, designing validated software. It's a very, very broad use case.
Great, thank you. You've answered my question. I misunderstood and thought you were talking about the vagaries of individual implementation on a well-defined use case.
No, I
think that there are many different categories of application, different products, slightly different. I mean, in a general sense, but there are individual understood differences in the actual application.
No. I mean, just like some of the use cases of the underpinning of creating scalable products is just very difficult. And now I just want to walk down this and talk about different aspects and how they relate also to kind of AI work, and also in some ways to the change control protocol guidance that came out, which is very related to this, right? I've spent the better part of the last half decade of my life trying to figure out how could you actually do all this at scale with proper change management very rapidly with still maintaining the highest level of validation. And hear what people think. So the first step after you plan and you kind of say, here's the general thing we need to do, is to perform risk analysis, right? And what are some best practices for that? As one, you should do risk analysis, and you should do risk analysis, to your product, to your infrastructure, to your business. We kind of, everything in our company runs under ISO 14971. You should track risk controls automatically, which means it should never be an insightful moment when you're trying to figure out, well, what are the non-product software pieces I'm deploying, right? Or what are the, risk controls I'm managing? And have I verified all the risk controls? We hear a lot of manual work about that because people don't computationally connect risk controls to the risk and then are able to track them across the system. one of the highlights of what we do is the ability to do that. And then again, to implement in your planning a risk-based software development process, so you can focus on the most critical things and what matters. And I think IEC 62304 is a great framework for that with the class ABC type software architecture. I think this part, right, which is the meat of the whole subject in some ways, is the ability to design, implement, build, and test software. So one thing that I think is obvious to software developers, but sometimes is hard in the medical industry, is you want to use the tools that you prefer, right? You want to use the tools that people know, that people can come in trained on. Because on one hand, you will need to teach them less, but on the other hand, there are certain features of modern software tooling that allows you to just do this at scale in a way that historical legacy systems just don't support, period, right? Like there are just features of AWS or GitHub or Jira or other kind of commonly used tools that are basically a necessity to do this type of work fast enough. The other thing is that you should use traceability not as a compliance requirement, but as a way to build software, because traceability is extremely powerful. We embed traceability across everything we do and in every kind of system, and that allows us to work, I think, much, much faster than most people even realize. And we tend to think that that's going to be also a common practice in regular software development one day, because we hear a lot of comments from people at large companies that say, you know, I'm not a regulated company, but what I spend a lot of time on is trying to understand why something is there, why a piece of code is there, and why is it causing a bug. And if I only had proper traceability, like they did when I worked in the medical device industry, for example, we would solve that problem. That's, you know, a great champion of ours quote, and he says, you know, they just save a lot of money even in tech companies if they did some of this. And then the other part is to generate the design history file automatically, and as well as other things. Now, for the AI and ML group, right, which is kind of all of us, this is the real piece that's a little bit different between software development and AI and ML systems, where just the design and test and implementation and build has this partner, which is the data and the model, right? So it's not just a software piece, it's also about the data that you're holding and about the model and retraining it over time. So there's just more types of configuration on top and different types of tests that you conduct. After this, after you've designed and thought a lot about what it is you're trying to build, you move into kind of the software supply chain space, right? What are the different building blocks I'm using? And I think this is a big difference between AI, data-driven software, cloud-based software to historical kind of embedded systems, is the fact that if you used to either use 1 or 2 or 5 software libraries, or you used to kind of copy and paste that code into your source code, now what you do is you work with hundreds and thousands of open source libraries for any machine learning or web connected project. And you now need to do basically incoming supplier evaluation on those different packages you're using, and then produce a software bill of materials. There has been a guidance that came out earlier this week that became effective in 24 hours. So it's effective starting, I think it was Wednesday, that says now kind of the FDA can refuse a submission if there's no software bill of materials or program to manage cybersecurity, vulnerability assessment, and so on. And I think that's a huge step in the right direction, because software has become many, many, many times more complex. And so ensuring that it is safe and reliable has become, you know, complexity to the end. So there's a lot of things to think about, right? From a SOOP perspective, software of unknown pedigree, connecting them to risks, how this all relates to your continuous integration and continuous deployment pipeline. I think it should all connect, so there's hard constraints, and that's one of the best advice I can give to folks trying to do this, is you should connect into your CI/CD some relation to the software bill of material and the SOOP management aspect of your work. So if you want to move fast and not break anything, you literally cannot deploy, for example, something that has an unapproved SOOP item. And the same can be true for your cloud infrastructure and API, although again, the cloud infrastructure could be a little more difficult because it's the cloud and you don't manage the underlying infrastructure necessarily. And this is a theme you're going to see in everything I talk about, is how can you take this aspect and connect it into CI/CD? The next aspect is, of course, the verification and validation of the software, where I think it's not just about making sure everything is traced and documented in the correct way, but also about computationally enforcing the acceptance criteria for your product. So, for example, if you say that without a certain document or without certain signatures, you can't deploy the software, well, why shouldn't that just be connected directly into your software build process? So it's not possible to do that. And the second thing is, again, traceability should not be something done after the fact. It should be embedded in everything you do, because it'll save a lot of time in all these different phases. Eventually, you get to final risk analysis. Again, implementing gates to make sure that the final risk analysis happens, release artifacts are generated, connected to continuous integration and continuous deployment pipelines, and then distributed, whether on the cloud or into devices in the field, and then into post-market surveillance. And for post-market surveillance, I recommend having good automated systems that can connect back into everything. Because if you're doing this at big scale, at a large company, at a large medical device company or pharmaceutical company, you're about to have many, many different complaints or product feedbacks. It's important to be able to triage them, to be able to understand how many of them are connected, and to respond to patients and regulators in a short timeline. I know patients who have been implanted with devices that went on a recall after weeks after implantation. And every time you hear that as a medical device professional, you're thinking, wow, that's the amount of time teams spend emailing each other, right, to get a response for something. And there is a huge human cost to us not doing this fast enough and ensuring that the products are safe enough for patients. I'm going to stop here just because this is a great slide to talk about, and then we can have a little discussion, and I can go to the last slide and then kind of close this. But when I always think about the challenge of building AI systems and the challenge of complex systems validation, I think of a very simple device. The simple device has some kind of pharmaceutical ingredient, so it's a combination product. Perhaps it's a pump that injects you with a certain medicine. It has a patient app that allows the patient to monitor certain things or communicate with a provider. It has some cloud-based engine to suggest dosing or to infer something about the vital signs of the patient. And maybe it has even a sensor that connects everything together. Even this very simple device, that might be the minimal thing you can build to support all this, would have thousands of design controls, thousands of open source dependencies, hundreds of people working on it, and managing them together to create a device that is safety critical enough for patients to trust is a massive undertaking. And I'm very proud to work with a lot of people who are doing this successfully at scale. And we really can't do it fast enough, because I think a lot of folks in the tech industry, right, everybody's so excited about AI and how it's going to affect healthcare. Well, it's going to be very challenging to have it affect healthcare anywhere, everywhere, and to be as safe as it needs to be. And it's also really needed, right? There's just not enough providers to support the population growth we have. And we need more and more ways to reduce the cognitive load of healthcare and to provide better healthcare locally to patients. That's kind of most of the talk. There's one more slide that I'll share after at the end, kind of about statistical process control and AI and ML, which I think will eventually become a good practice part of how you do these systems. Any questions, any discussion points, or maybe Simon, you want to kind of start some discussion around something?
Sure. One question I had is, how do you handle differences between, let's say, class A, B, and C software within your system?
So that's a great question. And that's very related to this idea of knowing everything, right? So our system, because you have segmented everything, and then you say, well, this specification relates to a class A product, the system can infer the different rules based on regulations or your own processes that would be required for those things. And then it can kind of take them through the right path for that, whether that's, you know, not generating certain documentation or removing some burden in some way. So that's the power, right, of having it all kind of in a computer.
Other questions from the group?
So in this example of a combination product where you have a AI ML engine cloud-based, how would you go about doing A/B testing?
Doing A/B testing to the cloud-based engine.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a difficult one, right? Because first of all, I would rather not do it in the market if I can avoid it. I'd rather do it kind of during the validation beta testing phase. But if you want to do it in the market, you'd need to create two different validated systems. Maybe through the recent PCCP guidance, you would be able to do that and modify them with time, and then basically create two of these systems, right? Validate them and then test them. Because at the end of the day, you can't do A/B testing in the way it's done on like websites, because people are like dependent on this for their lives. And I think that's why kind of making sure the design is right early on is pretty important. Does that make sense, Seema?
Yeah, I was wondering if like before you even bring it to market, you have some internal environment where you will mitigate the risk of doing it in the actual environment, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's what I mean by like the validation environment or the beta testing environment is, you know, maybe you have one hospital group or two hospital centers where, you know, you're legally allowed to do that, to test certain things. And then I think that's a good place for that. But ideally, you want to do, unlike traditional A/B testing, which is done at scale, you want to do this as kind of as pre-market as possible.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, makes sense.
Kind of along that thread, Erez, is how do you handle like different types of environments, let's say development, staging, and prod? Like how does the system kind of bring those together in terms of your development phases?
Yeah, so I think one is you should connect to those servers and retrieve their configuration. Again, depending on the risk of the application, right? It's all tied to the risk of what you're doing. But for a high-risk device like a combination product, you basically should record the configuration to the best of your abilities, the things that matter, right? If you like use an elastic beanstalk, configuration is very different than how we think about it in an embedded device. But I think recording it in the different environments, making sure that you're validating it on similar things in general, and then also implementing risk controls to prevent certain features of the change in cloud configuration environment. That's one aspect. The other aspect is having really good architecture that describes really neatly and cleanly what is part of the product, what is, for example, a multifunction like a non-medical device component, and what is just infrastructure to remove as much of that burden. How would you think about that, Simon? Actually, I would love to hear what you think as well.
I mean, it depends. It goes back to not all features in staging may end up in production. And so I'd have to figure out how to come up with some type of tracing mechanism, linking the environments, because you probably don't want to see everything that's happening in staging. Like production is obviously the most important, but yeah, so it boils down to traceability and risk to me.
Yeah, and baselining properly, right?
Yeah.
So I have a question about your traceability. You mentioned that throughout this development process, the traceability is connecting these different components. I understand, tracing your requirements and specifications and such. Are the actual software modules traceable? What level are you doing that at?
Yeah, for us, we do the kind of nuclear grade thing. We go the whole way. The files should be traced to different specs. The definitely the change control request, right? The like git change, code change request should be traced to a specific task, and through a task, and it's kind of a, not too complicated. Basically, a specification would connect to a task which is executed by engineer, and the engineer would place that task in their pull request, and then you'd have traceability all the way up. And I think, you know, reading like Good Principles of Software Validation, I think in the intro they explain quite well that this is pretty much a must-have, right, for any serious medical device companies, having the ability to trace from the code itself into the things you changed. And I think you probably know better than me, but that comes from a very long-term study the FDA did, that they discovered that, you know, 20% of all recalls, I think in the early 90s, was software related, and 80% of all those were a result of change. So that's how I think about it. And then also, if you do that, in our system, we'll pick up on that and kind of create automatically the expected code change review reports and things of that nature.
That's great.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that's also like, it's kind of like, you know, obvious. Like, you don't want to be stuck with like the code change review Excel spreadsheet, right? And create a lot of those and track them. It's just very hard, right? It's one of those things that is hard for a person to do, but is very easy for a computer. Like, computers were originally made to be like these filing systems, right? That you pull like a file from one place and put it in another. Well, it's, if you just tell it what to do, it's pretty good at doing that.
Right.
And let me now, as we're talking about this, and I also would love to hear the group's thought about this next slide, because this is an idea I've been working on for a long time, and I think it's the obvious next step of how AI and machine learning systems should be done under rapid change, which is statistical process control. So kind of when I was at MIT, my thesis was about the limits of analytics during black swan events and what happens to machine learning models. It was specifically a forecasting model during an event like COVID-19. And one of the things you see is that these models are not great at correcting themselves for kind of short-term data. But that's just in the real space of the output. Where it is very interesting, and you see a lot of information, is in the error space. So if you take some machine learning model and you look at its error, and you track that error over time, I think there's a lot of value from performing statistical process control on the error to make sure that it is under control. And if not, that you have a way to create deviations and manage them over time. And then, of course, the question is like, what error? Well, that depends on your model, your intended use, and your company. But this is something I'd love to hear some people's thoughts about. It's an idea that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I think it would make things auditable and provable, but also would be give companies quite a lot of power deciding with their SMEs what to do, but then also having a system to track everything. And I think it flows well with how kind of bioprocessing is done.
I think a question on my mind, my background is in bioprocess operations. And I've really enjoyed your talk. Your outlines seem very powerful and logical and prescient. But it seems to me that very little of it is AI or ML specific, that it would apply to any software applications in especially medical devices. Can you address that just briefly for me?
Yeah, so I would say we started off really focused on AI. And that was my background. That's the challenge I saw. Like, how do you build AI in healthcare? And then we realized, well, you know, before we fix how you build AI, people have an issue with just building software in general in healthcare. And we've kind of progressively solved that problem. And I think folks who've played around with the platform are like, yeah, this is like a very different way to do this. And now we're progressively integrating kind of more machine learning ops and tools around that. But I think, you know, a lot of the software stuff, things that are done in 62304 apply immediately to AI systems. It's just another, you know, it's a very robust, very complicated statistical method, but people have been using statistical methods in bioprocessing for a long time, right? And there are things in place for that. So I think we out of necessity, we first had to solve how do you build software, and now we're solving how do you build it for AI and ML. And there's just, you know, in some ways there's less than AI and ML than you would think, but also you first need to build the basis, right? If I go back to that chart we had, this one, right? There's a long way up until you get to the valid. And I would say that the AI system, right, sits kind of here on top of all this. And we just basically needed to rebuild software development within a validated universe.
Thank you. That's what I perceived.
Yeah, it was a long journey. It's still ongoing.
Where do you see the most value from the overall framework? Is it in the ability to not forget anything and not blow it? Or is it to the audit logging and checking, or the FDA approvals, or where do you see it?
I think that first of all, it's in the ability to produce safe and reliable software for patients. And I say that very seriously. I think like I've aligned the entire company around that, because I think every company that builds stuff for patients, that's really their mission, right? They want to make sure that they don't make mistakes and that people get good treatment. So I would say it starts with that, like how do you help people make safe and reliable software and remove issues? But then with time, what we're seeing is a few different value props. One is you reduce compliance risk because the computer takes care of a lot of things that are kind of scary and hard to maintain. You can move faster because you're using modern tools, better infrastructure, more connectivity. And then you can also hire better people in the R&D team, or just maintain people, because I think engineers, you know, as I being one of them, transitioning into the medical industry, can become very frustrated with the tools. And, you know, there's a huge turnover issue in this industry with software engineers. So I think there's a bunch of different factors we can help with. And so there's kind of a side for the R&D folks to move faster and use the tools they want with less burden, and a side for the quality folks to get into the processes and tools and make sure everything works perfectly, or as it should. I know we're almost out of time, but Simon, I would actually love to hear your thoughts as well about this. Like you're so experienced, you've seen this in so many different environments. Like, how do you think of it? Because I know you're a pharma person as well. You've worked kind of on both sides of the regulated software ecosystem.
I mean, taking the AI and ML lens, like what I would see is having charts that are monitoring your precision and recall over time, and seeing if there's any drift so that you could take corrective action. And so that's like specific to the AI piece. But yeah, I think, you know, anything that you could automate and provide a visual guide for people to respond to, I think it's a great step forward.
And, you know, and I always think also this is just like, it's kind of a continuation of the way you audit healthcare companies anyway, right? This is what you'd want to see in their manufacturing facility. This is just another form of manufacturing, right? Software manufacturing. Yeah, as part of pre-cert, like this would definitely be a chart that you would demonstrate that your processes are still within control to the FDA if they, you know, if they had questions. Yeah. Yeah. And I always say, folks like that find this challenging, I always say, well, you know, the FDA regulates biologics. Like biologics is a scary thing. If you've ever been in a biologist plant, they like feed it, right? They don't really manufacture it like you think of regular products. And if we could solve that, right, what can't we solve? And maybe, I don't know if there's any other questions. Y'all are welcome to reach out to me if you need anything, or if we can help you in anything you're doing. But Simon, I don't know if you want to have any last words or any last questions.
Yeah, no, thank you, Aris, for the presentation. It was extremely insightful. I'm excited to see how your product evolves over time. And just one quick announcement for the group. Our next session will be on April 21st at the same time. If you're interested in participating or have speakers, please let me know. And also, if you're aware of other AI ML experts that would be interested in joining our group and the discussion, please refer them to Timothy. So thank you so much, everyone, and I hope you have an amazing weekend.
Thank you.
Y'all.
Thanks all.
Thank you, Aris.
Thanks.